Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to share with you a project that pushed my sewing skills to new heights and I've been wanting to do for quite a while, and that is to make myself an 1860s corset. Roll intro. Now this project is part of a larger kind of two-part project that I'm going to go more into depth in the next video about, but that video is probably not going to come out until about July. But until then, I wanted to share with you the process of designing and making this corset, going through like the pattern, the mock-up, and then my version, because I'm going to be using the same pattern with a few alterations for the next corset that I'm making. Also, since this is going to be a two-part process, I thought it would be cool to offer, if you guys had any questions, comments, or suggestions about this corset project or any of my projects or like anything in general, to go ahead and put those in the comments down below. And in the next video in this series, I will answer some of those questions and comments, and I thought that might be kind of a cool way to engage with you guys. So I have actually made myself a corset before. This actually ended up kind of being the mock-up, and I loved it so much that I just finished it. And it has quite a few problems, but you know, it works well. It's really comfortable. And that one was much more 1890s, and this time we wanted to go for something more 1860s. I had a surprisingly difficult time finding any real 1860s corset patterns, like not the costume ones or the recreations, but like actual museum specimens or things like that. I'm not really sure why I was having so much trouble finding them, but I did manage to find one, and that was in the book titled Corsets, Historic Patterns and Techniques by Jill Salin. I hope I'm saying that right. By Jill Salin. I picked the one labeled Red and Black Lasting Corset from 1860. The design was pretty simple with only 5 panels and really simple vertical lines. Part of the reason why I wanted an 1860s corset was because the shape of it is pretty classic. 1890s is fairly streamlined while having an hourglass shape, but if you look at it from the side like this, you're going to have a very flat front. But in the 1860s, they were all about the 360 view, which is why they had huge circular hoop skirts for their gowns, and they had an hourglass shape no matter what direction you looked at them from. So having an 1860s corset was actually kind of similar to having a 1950s corset, because it was very shapely in whichever direction you looked at it. So while I really liked having this historical pattern to go from, I didn't really like the actual like design elements of this piece, just because it's very simple, it's not all that unique. And you know me, I gotta do everything the hard way, so I kept looking for a few more historical examples of 1860s corsets, looking for some with something really unique about them. And I managed to find this one on Pinterest. I'll try to find the actual source and link it down below. It is technically from 1864, I believe, and the shape of it is just incredible. I mean, that whole wall of boning, there's actually 13 bones there, and the 2 bust gores, and I didn't really have a picture of the back of it, but the whole shape of it was just gorgeous with that really dramatic hip panel and everything. So I wanted to try to take this corset pattern and turn it into a design that looked similar to this. So I got out my paper and tape, and I got to work trying to modify this pattern to be more like this one. This corset was actually pretty unusual because it didn't open at the front. It only laced closed, and the bit on the side said something like this was designed for a higher class lady that would always be able to have maids or people around her to help her get into this. So that probably also means that we're going to have a lot of drama in the shape, which I think is very exciting. We've got a lot of hip spring here, as you can see. This also comes out quite a bit, which is very lovely. I think all 3 of these together are going to create some really pretty shapes. You can also see here on the side back that it comes up, which I think is very nice. It gives a lot of support without getting the bust too high. Over here you can see this is the side front, and this is the side itself. So this right here is probably the bust point. This is going to be the very close to where the widest part of the bust is. and this is obviously going to be how high it is. So if we want to figure out what the waist measurement is going to be, we need to measure, we need to figure out how this grid works. It looks like it's in groups of 5, and we're going to count across at basically the narrowest point on all of these. It helpfully says right here that the scale is in inches. So doing a little more calculating, we have her basic measurements, and then we have the corset's measurements, which I'm actually kind of impressed that I was able to count this, what I'm guessing is correctly, because it's actually 17.6, 12.4, 17.6. So there's the same amount of difference between the waist and the bust as there is between the waist and the hips, which is awesome, because that tells me exactly what shape of silhouette we are aiming for, and that is having the bust measurement being the same as the hips measurement. So these are all in halves, by the way. Since a corset is exactly the same on both sides, you only have to really worry about 1/2 of the measurement at a time. There are a few other things that I noticed which were very interesting, which is, despite the fact that on the website it really looked like that kind of conical hourglass 1860s shape, you do have most of the curve in the front being here, and then the back being here for the hips. I think the next thing for me to do is to cut this out and make kind of a paper toile. There's a lot of drama in this back here. Check that out. The harder it is to get them to match up nicely, the more drama there is in the shape. Alright, so this is kind of what it looks like. Whole half a corset right here. So you can really see how conical, how much of an hourglass shape you get from this. Like, look at how dramatic those curves are. You can see it on every angle. You can see it here, you can see it this way, that way. Like, you can see just how much it is curved in the round, which is very typical, as I understand, of the 1860s. Once you get further towards the 1870s, you start getting more shape in the back and a straighter front, so you wouldn't have this happening. But 1860s, with the perfectly round circle skirts, you're going to have the most roundness to your shape, where no matter what angle you're looking at the person, you are going to be seeing a huge amount of hourglass shaping, which is just beautiful. I'm very excited to see this in here. What I'm going to do next is probably one of my favorite things in the world, and that is creating new seams. So the end goal is to have this be our final shape, but we can move the seams around pretty much wherever we want. So what I want to do is create this hip panel right here. So I think it's going to start probably about here, and it's going to go right under the waist. Something kind of like that. So you kind of got to look at it in different sections. Where would it be really nice to have some extra roundness? Because as you can see, as soon as you've got these dramatic curves, it's going to want to sit in a kind of a funny way. But hopefully, if it's got its own shape like this, we should be able to create a much smoother hip area, just because we're not dealing with these sharp seams. And then the other thing is, here's our bust. We could definitely take chunks out from like in here. Okay, something kind of like that. It still sort of follows these shapes in here. Okay, so now comes the fun part where we cut this apart again. So you can see we still have a little bit of this shape in here, and then we're just going to meet them up this way. So we had all of this space that had been taken out to create that really dramatic curve, but instead of trying to make a dart, we're just going to kind of soften this a little bit. So now, let's cut out these gores. the hip here. And yeah, I think this is starting to come together. I am very excited about this. So the next thing I did was I put together a pretty simple fabric mock-up. So I didn't put in any boning into the mock-up because there's not really a whole lot of point. I kind of just wanted to see what it looked like on its own. And also I didn't put any lacing in the back. I just sewed the back panels together. And part of my reasoning for that was I didn't want to have that extra variable when fitting it. So I went ahead and sewed those two back panels together, so I would just close it in the front, which should have been a good warning that the pattern was a bit too big, but honestly I just really wanted to see what it looked like as is. So after I did the mock-up, I was very excited because it fit beautifully. It's perfect. I don't know how that happened, but it is absolutely perfect. How? How did I do that? So I had a few different options for fabric for mine, and as I have been, I'm using fabrics from my stash. Again, if you haven't watched any of my videos before, several family members have been extremely kind to donate to me a whole bunch of unused fabrics, and some of these are fairly simple, some of them are kind of cheap, but a lot of them are just gorgeous gems that they used for various projects and had extra of, or they were going to use for a project and just never got around to it. Either way, some of these pieces are just beautiful, and I fell in love with this champagne colored chrysanthemum silk type thing. I'm not sure it actually is silk, but whether or not it is an absolutely beautiful fabric. It is fairly stiff, not as stiff as a few of the other options that I had, but I was very glad that I just barely had enough. I used up almost every scrap of that fabric. So I'm very glad that I had it, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So the next thing I did was I cut out the pieces. Since the outline of the pattern is actually the seam lines and not counting in seam allowance, I cut quite a bit of extra on the outside of each piece. There are a couple things that I think I'll do different next time in the cutting out process. One of those being, I think I like having the pieces on this, like, still connected to each other, because it made a few things a little easier and it helped it feel a bit more sturdy as I was doing a few of the easy steps. So that's one thing. And number two, next time I am using another pattern fabric, so I want to try even harder to make some of the patterns match up nicely. So that's two little things that I'd like to do. So for this corset, I'm doing double layers, which is basically you have your fashion fabric, which is this beautiful chrysanthemum silk, and then on the inside I have very plain cotton fabric that's kind of cream colored that I wanted to have on the inside because that's the side that is more likely to get dirty. And also the silk, I'm going to call it silk even though it probably isn't pure silk. This silk frays really easily, so it's pretty necessary to have a sturdy fabric underneath as well. I left the top open on pieces 2 and 3 to allow the insertion of boning later. Also, I had to remember to leave the front pieces pretty much entirely alone because I need to insert the bust. The next thing I did was to add the lacing strips in the back, and I got some white lacing strips which are pre-made out of like a really heavy canvas. And I had to do it by machine because they are very sturdy fabrics, so it would have been quite hard on me to try to do it by hand. You really have to be careful to only have about a 1/16 of an inch on the outside of it. And you have to make sure that you go really slow and steady because there are a ton of layers. I wanted a little bit of extra stiffness around the outside of the hip panel. I could have done some piping, but I didn't really have easy access to a zipper foot at that time. Instead, I did a machine embroidery stitch. I tried out a few different options, and I thought that this diamond pattern was really cute, so I decided I would do a row of that around the edge. And I also wanted to have a little bit along the back next to the lacing strips. And I decided to go with just plain white embroidery because I thought it would help tie in the white of the lacing strips a little bit and make it look a little bit less weird to have that there. And then I needed to go to the store to find some thread that would match the fabrics that I had. So I did manage to find 2 threads that look pretty good. They were both very expensive, shockingly so. I did not think that it would cost $20 for 2 spools of thread. But I did end up finding 2 colors that matched quite well in the embroidery thread section. So it's not the strongest thread, but they matched perfectly. I also realized that the front panel wasn't shaped quite right because I had the first 2 bones stopping partway up, going into the first of the bust gores, but I did realize that those boning channels needed to go all the way up. So I added in the busk, which is a fairly easy process actually, and I'll go more into depth into that if you are curious, but it's a relatively easy process once you learn how to do it. And I was very happy to have the matching thread because it was beautiful, and so I'm pretty proud of the way that I put the busk in. And I added in some of the boning channels. And then I started working on the bust gores, and this ended up being a much bigger hassle than I expected because I wanted it to look like it was slightly behind the boning channels that were on the front, and I don't know, it was just really annoying to try to get it to shape right. I don't know how they did it on the original one. I think next time I'll actually add the bust gores into the individual pieces of fabric before I attach them together. That way they're sandwiched in between. I might also end up changing the pattern a little bit because I basically just had a dart taken out a little bit where the bust gore was going to be in. So once you got down to the point at the bottom, you really didn't have any fabric to work with. So I'm going to have to do a bit more research on how to do that nicely. I ended up making them look okay. They're a little raggedy, but it's not too bad. I also removed bone number 6, which was the one that was right at the outer edge of panel number 1. I'm going to do something kind of crazy. I'm going to get rid of bone number 6. There's 2 reasons for this. Number 1, I don't think that it's going to make much sense at all to try to have this piece on the end. It's so thin, it's only 1 bone wide, and trying to connect that to all of this just sounds like a headache. And it didn't mess up things too much. I feel like the hip panel didn't fit, but it seemed to not fit more than just that centimeter, so I don't know. I also added in some boning channels in the light pink fabric. Most of the boning channels in this corset are internal bones, which means that they're actually between the 2 strips of fabric. But when I have the seams together, I wanted to have the inside be nice and smooth, so I would put the seam allowance on the outside and then cover it with a bit of fabric for external bones. When I inserted the bones, I tried to think of which direction the bones should be oriented. The plastic boning comes in a large roll, like tape, and the bones really like to hold their shape, so they'll have this kind of circular bend to them. And for a lot of parts of the corset, you want to have the shape be like this. So if it's over here on the side, you want to have them be bent like that to kind of accentuate some of the hourglass shape. In other parts, you might want to have it shaped more like this, like around a bust or something like that. You want to have it be a bit more convex. And then in certain parts, like where I have all of those parallel bones, I actually wanted to have them be a little more straight. So I would alternate convex and concave all the way along. I attached the hip panel, which ended up being a bit too big because of some of the alterations that I had made. I think next time I'll attach it under the other pieces instead of over. If you look up real close, you can see that the hip panel looks like it's placed on top and then top stitched down. And then I wanted to try on the corset before adding the trim, and it was beautiful. It's very comfortable and has a lovely shape. I hadn't seen this pattern on me with the bones yet, so it was really fun to see how it looked. I did forget to put the boning in the lacing strips, which made the back pucker, and I was really confused there for a bit, but I eventually figured it out. Then I added the trim, which I will admit I did a kind of a terrible job on. It's very uneven, and I think part of that was just because I was rushing. It's been kind of a crazy couple of months, and I just wanted to get it done. So I definitely need to figure out better ways of attaching the trim. I think I had it be a little bit too skinny, the strips that I cut out, so it kept fraying on me. Also, I didn't cut it on the bias, which I will definitely do next time, but I wanted to make sure that I had enough fabric for the next one as well. So yeah, there's that too. I added in a bit of short edging lace between 2 strips of trim for the top, which just gave it a little bit of extra flair. It was really cute. I liked it. In the end, I'm really proud of this piece. For being only the second finished corset that I've ever made, I think it turned out absolutely beautiful. The fabric that I used was gorgeous. The pattern shape is absolutely beautiful. And, you know, I'd only ever finished one corset before this, and that one was initially intended to be a mock-up, and I had, you know, boning strips that I had bought, and I had like actual bias tape to work with for the trim and everything, so, you know, everything that I was struggling with I had never really done before. I had never made a corset with such fancy fabric. Honestly, I don't think I've ever used fabric this nice for anything before. So there was a big learning curve. I ended up using almost all of the fabric. I had very little left over. The fit isn't perfect. I am tempted to go back and move the lacing strips in another couple of centimeters on either side. There is a little bit of space left in the back, and I would really like it to be a little bit smaller. I'd like to end up having about an inch in the back if I'm wearing it just comfortably, so that I have a little bit more space if I want to tight lace it a smidge. Also, the top and bottom stick out, which I think is because the corset is a little too big for me. So enough of me jabbering on, let's take a look at the final product.